What's up guys, welcome to my 5th Tera class guide, the guide to Sorcerers. I rank sorcs as the 3rd hardest class to play below warriors and mystics. They've got quite a learning curve and take a bit of practice because their spells all have different ranges and fire differently, but they're a really fun class to play and pump out tons of damage, so let's get started. First on the sorc skill list is their basic attack, Fireball. This basic attack does not restore mana and serves more as a filler ability that will eventually get phased out completely. Meaning once at max level you won't use this skill anymore. You may even take it off your hotkey bar, and this is something you would only do as a sorc. This speaks a bit of why I said they're fairly difficult to play. You can strafe backward while casting this at lower levels though, and make no mistake, you will be using this skill for a long time. Before I get further into the guide though, I want you all to be aware that the sorc class completely changes at level 48. Until level 48 you will be subpar DPS. Your damage will be decent, but it won't stand out too much. At level 48, however, you will all of a sudden become the strongest damage dealing class in Tera and remain that way for the rest of your sorc life. Second on your list will be Flame Pillar. This is a close range spell that hits all enemies in front of you repeatedly, the downside being that you have to be incredibly close to use it. This spell is great at early levels and you should use it to kill mobs quickly. It can be glyphed to do more damage, but don't grow too fond of this skill. It is a bad idea to use it on bosses and in dungeons because of its short range, and you'll eventually stop using it altogether and probably remove it from your bar. Next is easily your most important spell in your arsenal, Mana Condensing. Unlike priests and mystics' mana infusion, this skill works in combat while attacking or being attacked. It can be glyphed to give more mana, and I recommend glyphing it at later levels. I'll explain why later on though. It's important to note that a lot of your glyphs as a sorc will revolve around your mana regen, and at lower levels you might get frustrated and confused by this, as other classes get damage glyphs and utility glyphs. Once you hit 48 though, you'll understand why it is all that sorcs need. Mana cost and reduction glyphs are very important, and you'll be using them a lot, including this spell once you get higher level. As a sorc you will also get backstep like the other ranged classes. It's neat at lower levels, but this skill will be replaced completely later on, so I won't go into it. Fourth is a spell called Magma Bomb. This is your first core damage ability. You'll need to familiarize yourself with the range at which this spell does damage, because you will be using it a lot, and while it is easy to hit targets standing still with it in grooves, while kiting and soloing you'll need to time it and aim it properly so that it hits. Don't worry though, the range on this skill's damage is very forgiving, unlike some of the spells you get later on. One thing to note about this is that you can glyph Magma Bomb to have a chance to reset its cooldown. This is an incredibly good glyph to get. I've had times where I was able to spam Magma Bomb up to 7 times in a row, and given that it is instant cast, it can get very bursty. Next up is Painful Trap, a skill that has a fairly long cast time and not a lot of practical applications. This is another spell that won't make the cut at higher levels. It has its uses for its damage at lower levels if you drop one before engaging in combat and lure mobs into it, or drop it on a large group of mobs, or sit in it during PvP. Your sixth spell is Time Gyri, or Gyre, or whatever. This is essentially a snare that can be used in a ton of situations. Now it's very important to note that this is a snare, not a root, stun, or interrupt. You can use it on bands that are running to stop them, but you won't actually interrupt them or root them. They can still use abilities and will continue on whatever ability it is they were using when you hit them with this. Most of their abilities make them move too, so this snare has little effects on bands. However, it can help a lancer get time to leash it if it is running away. The practical applications of this spell are for PvP, to set up burst combos and CC combos, or protect yourself from melee. I'll go over the good spells to use with this as they come up. Ice Needle is your next core ability, and it goes very nicely with Magma Bomb, given both of them are instant cast. You can glyph this to have reduced cooldown, and I recommend you do. This will be your main ability because of how easy it is to use. It hits all targets in a line, passing through them for good AoE damage and slowing them. It has a fairly short cooldown and can be used easily a lot in PvE and PvP situations. Also note the slowing component to the spell that slows the movement speed of anybody hit by it, making it easier to kite melee that are training onto you in PvP, or kite mobs that you're kiting around while doing damage to them. I'd like to briefly go over something calculated into spells like this. First thing to note is that sorcerers are an AoE class. With the exception of about 3 skills, every single one of your spells hits multiple targets, and you'll quickly notice that the more targets you hit, the less damage you do to them. Spells that shoot in a line are no exception to this, but the damage they deal is calculated differently than AoE spells that hit all at once. The first target you hit with a spell in a line like this will take the full brunt of the damage. and then the following targets will take much less, rather than the damage being split evenly like your other AoE spells. This is the case for all spells that fire in a line in your arsenal. How you use this information is up to you, but make sure you're aware it is happening. Next is Pain Blast, an AoE poison that hits up to 5 targets. Note that though this initial burst of the spell can hit more than 5 targets, only 5 targets that are hit will be affected by the poison. This, like Magma Bomb, has a unique place it hits, so make sure you get used to where this skill lands when you use it and aim it properly. Also note that the initial damage of this spell when it hits is affected by gear, but the damage over time it puts on your enemies is not, and deals a set amount, meaning that this spell is good for its initial burst, but the damage over time it puts on enemies is rather useless, so the fact that it does less damage to players is negligible and doesn't make this skill bad in PvP. Manasiphon is your second mana return skill. This is a good way to get mana back quickly if you don't have time to use mana condensing, and very good for stealing mana from players. Charged, it can take up to 900 mana from another player, and 900 is a lot considering player mana pools are not that big. More importantly is the fact that you can move while charging this, so it is very easy to use in all situations. Unfortunately, there is a bug with this skill that makes it start auto-casting after you use it, every time it's off cooldown, even if you don't try to use it. The skill will just cast by itself and charge itself and can be rather annoying. The way to fix this is to try and use the skill again while it is auto-casting, or just relog your character. Glacial Retreat is not a resort, but your main escape ability as a sorc. Not only is this an escape ability, it does a lot of AoE damage while using it, and it is instant, and you'll find yourself using it simply for its burst damage in PvE. It's a good combo to use this with Magma Bomb, as it will give you the correct distance from your opponents and slow them so that Magma Bomb will hit. In PvP, this is an amazing escape because of how crippling it is to melee. If they don't have a gap closer off cooldown, this will give you the distance you need to hit them with some spells. Your next skill is called Arcane Pulse. This is a great charge skill for PvE, be it doing AoE damage or single target hitting a BAM. This is your third hardest hitting spell when fully charged. Unfortunately, this is another spell that will not make the cut when you get your playstyle revamp at level 58, so I won't go into it much. I don't recommend ever trying to charge this in PvP as it is easily dodged and you can't move while charging it. Flaming Barrage is your next skill on the list and one of your most valuable damage skills. It is your fourth hardest hitting skill and will be your main source of damage in PvP and PvE. Firstly in PvE because this spell is a great gap filler. It has a very short cooldown and hits decently hard on single targets, but it's a waste of time trying to use it for an AoE pull unless it's a mob group that moves too fast to be hit by your other spells like minions, or they are very spread out. This fits nicely into any damage rotation between any spells because it's almost always off cooldown, so it's a good idea to glyph this to cost less mana. I'll go over sorc rotations at the end of the video though. In PvP, this will be your main damage skill because of how hard it hits and the lack of aiming required. Any PvPer with some experience will be able to dodge the majority of your skills, and this one is impossible to dodge while it still deals some hefty damage, and on top of that, you can almost spam it. So in 1v1 situations where you are kiting, use this. Next is Teleport Jaunt. Like the Mystic version of the spell, it's a great escape and can be glyphed to have its cooldown reset. You'll want to glyph it for PvP because as a sorc you're incredibly squishy, and getting caught by other damage dealers usually means an instant game over, at least until you get Mana Shield, but I'll go over sorc survivability later on. Note that once you get this ability you no longer need backstep because you can't use this and backstep at the same time. They share the same cooldown. Mind Blast is your next spell. This is an AoE sleep that has no hit cap, but is pretty tricky to use. This is a long cast time and casts in front of you, as well as a long cooldown, so make sure you don't miss. It's a good idea to combo this spell with Time Gyri to make sure it hits. Time Gyri doesn't last long, but this sleep lasts a bit longer and gives you the time to set up a perfect kill combo in PvP. In PvE, this spell works as CC or as an interrupt to a BAM. Fire Blast. Oh, Fire Blast. Your life as a sorceress was empty and hollow up until this point. This is your hardest hitting skill and the second hardest hitting ability in Tera, so I'm going to spend a bit of time on this one. First, it has a fairly long cast time, so while soloing, it's only smart to use this to initiate a pull. By the time the mobs recognize you as a threat and run to engage you, you'll be able to land a hit with this, taking out most of their hit points instantly. Second, it has a hefty mana cost. I recommend glyphing the shit out of this spell for its mana cost reduction, cast speed reduction, and increased damage to multiple targets. This is an incredible AoE spell and an incredible single target nuke, as long as your target stays in it long enough to get hit by it. The cast time is wavered later on though, so I'll explain the skill in a bit more detail when I go over damage rotations at the end of this video. Suffice to say, it's great to use this in PvP with Time Gyre and Mind Blast if you can, but don't try casting it on someone that is mobile, as everyone will be very, very aware of how dangerous this spell is, and they've most likely spent years playing MMOs and learned not to stand in fire. This spell is one of the main reasons sorcs excel in groups. It's your main damage skill, but it roots you in place, meaning you will have a hard time landing it without a party member holding mobs for you. Thus, sorcs excel at AoE grinding when grouped with a Lancer. While sorcs end up being the highest DPS class at max level, they're required to stand still in order to pump out their big numbers. Next up is Lightning Trap, a much more useful trap than the Painful Trap. This is an AoE stun. The stun is short, but it's AoE and great for PvP as well as soloing while AoE grinding. You can drop this trap, pull a large group of mobs, and then when they're running into it, you can drop a Fire Blast on them. Or you can hide in it for PvP and force enemies to engage into it. It has a long cast time though, so don't use it too reactively. 17th on the list is a spell called Overchannel. This spell is basically a buff on whatever spell you use next. I recommend using it with either Fire Blast or Void Pulse, which is coming up. You should use this ability as often as possible with those two spells and glyph it for a lower cooldown so it is up more often. Next is Void Pulse, your second hardest hitting ability. This is a single target nuke that you can use in combination with Fire Blast to do some nasty burst damage. This spell has a really slow missile speed though, making it pretty easy to dodge in PvP, and it can miss in PvE if you are too far away from the BAM and it moves after you fire it. It has a really long range though. Make sure you are using this spell off cooldown even in AoE pulls because of how hard it hits. You should glyph the shit out of this spell and make sure it has reduced mana cost and cooldown because its mana cost is quite hefty. 19th on the list, and not a moment too soon, is your Mana Barrier ability. This is the skill that prevents you from being one-shot, so get fond of it. It lasts 45 seconds and has a 2-minute cooldown, so you can't always have it up. It can be glyphed to increase your damage for 15 seconds, making it a nifty DPS cooldown, but in PvP you should use this reactively if you are getting focused. In PvE, you should almost never be getting hit, but in cases where you are in trouble, put this shield up, especially if you get a dot on yourself. This shield gives your healer time to react or prevents you from being obliterated in cases where you are about to take unavoidable damage. Burning Breath is the next skill you will learn, and this skill is an odd one to say the least. First, it is a lock-on skill, but it is instant cast and castable while moving, so it's great in PvP situations despite the fact that it says it does less damage to players. Secondly, I'll point out that this DOT works like a poison dot. It does a set amount of damage, not based on your gear. This is both a good and a bad thing. It's bad because once you hit max level, you'll get heavily geared, and this spell won't keep up with your other spell's damage. It's good because its damage is not mitigated, even in PvP. Also note that this spell has a rare glyph you can buy after farming hard modes that makes it reduce the healing taken by the target, making it amazing for setting up kills as it forces a dispel while you are nuking. This spell is always good to use though in situations where you are forced to be mobile because you can cast it without stopping running. I'm going to skip over your level 48 skill and the most important skill for now, and cover it at the end with the damage rotations. So next I'll go into your level 52 skill called Hailstorm. This is a great all-around spell for PvP and PvE. It does massive AoE damage, and in PvP it completely shuts down any melee trying to train you. It has a very high slow component, and can even be used to save healers if you drop the storm on them when they have melee on them. Alternatively, cast this on yourself and just sit in it. Most players are smart enough not to go into it, but it still protects you and your party for its duration. It's great for kiting and setting up Fire Blast on large AoE pulls when soloing as well. The last two spells I'll go over are both PvP spells. The first is a lock-on silence skill that can hit up to 4 players, silencing them for 10 seconds. This is an incredibly powerful form of CC that prevents your enemies from doing anything unless dispelled, though they can still move. It has a 2-minute cooldown. Because of this spell and the next, despite your squishiness in PvP, in proper teamfights, and when you are guarded, you become a force to be reckoned with. But note this spell is useless in PvE and there's no point in hotkeying it if you're only doing dungeons. Your last spell is called Mana Volley, another really strong PvP spell that sucks the mana out of your enemies. You'll initially think that this is great for sucking mana out of healers, but it doesn't just cripple healers. Take into account that in Tera, mana pools aren't that big, and more than that, both Slayers and Berserkers have to land basic attacks to gain mana to begin with. Hitting them with this shuts down damage and healing of a large group of enemies while restoring mana to yourself. You'll be using this a lot in PvE too because of the mana issues you'll start to have, but I'll go over that next. Alright, now the final spell. Up to this point, leveling as a sorc you'll start having trouble soloing, and you'll have trouble keeping up with other damage dealers. You may start to hate your class and ask yourself, what spell could I possibly get at 48 that magically makes sorcs the highest damage dealing class? Well, here it is. At level 48 you get a spell called Burst of Celerity, and up until this point you've realized you have been living a half-life, an unfulfilled caster life. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this skill, so prepare yourself. At first glance, this spell is very lackluster. It increases your attack speed by 20%. Now, it's important to note that in Tera, attack speed is a global stat, and you're better off thinking of it as an animation speed, because what this stat does is increase the animation of all of your skills. Second thing to note is that there is a difference between attack speed and charge speed. This spell does not affect your charging up skills, but it does affect your instant cast spells. Yes, instant cast spells are affected by attack speed. Why? Because attack speed increases the animation. Hell, it even increases how fast you jump backward when you use Glacial Retreat. Now, 20% isn't a big deal, so the first thing you're going to want to do when you get to spells, glyph it so that it's 70% attack speed. So, here's an example what a typical rotation looks like before level 48. Now here's an example of your rotation after you get this spell. Notice the difference? Before you get this spell, your rotation would roughly be Fire Blast into Flame Barrage into Void Pulse into Flame Barrage, and repeat. Fill in with Magma Bomb and Ice Needle and Pain Blast when needed. Your rotation after you get this spell should be something like Yep. Cast every single spell you can off cooldown. Button mash. It's for this reason that Arcane Pulse is cut, because it doesn't get boosted by this spell. Joking aside, there's a little finesse to be used, so I'll go into the proper sorc rotation. A typical rotation should start by using Overchannel, and if you've glyphed your mana shield for the strength boost, use it too. Then, use Celerity and immediately cast Fire Blast. Follow it with Void Pulse, Ice Needle, Magma Bomb, Fire Barrage, Pain Blast, Ice Needle, Fire Barrage, and then hit Flame Blast again with another overcharge. If you do it correctly, you should be able to have Celerity up for every single Fire Blast you cast, making your damage skyrocket. Maintaining this rotation will do 3 things. 1. Make bosses die incredibly fast. 2. Make you pull aggro incredibly fast if your Lancer doesn't know what he's doing. And 3. Run you out of mana incredibly fast. This is why I said mana condensing was such an important skill. You'll want to make sure it is up 100% of the time and make sure you've glyphed everything with mana reduction. Otherwise you won't be able to maintain this rotation. Even with mana condensing though, you'll still constantly run short on mana unless you have a mystic babysitting you with blue balls, so don't be afraid to throw in some Manasiphons. Try to initiate a pull with mana condensing already on yourself before you start your first rotation as well. This will help with your mana issues. And also don't forget to keep Hailstorm up. Hailstorm doesn't have a cast time, so you don't really need to use it while Celerity is up, so use it during the downtime that Celerity isn't up. Though Celerity has a very short cooldown of 25 seconds, while its uptime is 15 seconds, so it should be up a lot. That's all for the sorc guide. I hope you found this useful. Overall, sorcs are a great AoE and single target DPS class, but they excel in groups and have trouble dealing damage to highly mobile targets or when they need to be highly mobile themselves. They're also very squishy and can't take many hits, which is why they're fairly difficult to master. I'll be doing a warrior guide next, so make sure you like, comment, and subscribe for more guide videos. See you later.